fog in the high ridges of the Appalachian Trail doesn't roll in like normal weather. It creeps up from the deep ravines like a thick, living curtain of gray wool, swallowing giant oak trees whole and wiping out every landmark until you feel like you are walking through an endless, floating void. My name is Mark, and I have been an experienced wilderness guide in western North Carolina for over 8 years, taking groups of adventurous tourists through the rugged backcountry trails. I thought I knew these mountains like the back of my hand. Every dangerous drop, every hidden spring, and every bend in the dirt path. But there are dark, unmapped corners of these ancient ridges where human maps mean absolutely nothing. The old-timers in the mountain towns always tell hikers that when you reach the crest of Black Ridge, you must turn back before you reach the sharp, rocky cliff face, known as Dead Man's Ridge. They say that where the physical ridge ends, something else begins, a realm of shifting fog and a distorted time where the mountain takes what it wants and never gives it back. I always laughed off their warnings as cheap regional superstition, designed to keep reckless college kids from falling off dangerous cliffs at night. But a harrowing 3-day solo backpacking trip in late October shattered my skepticism forever. It was late afternoon on a chilly Thursday when I reached the high elevation section of the trail, carrying a heavy 50-pound backpack loaded with survival gear, a thermal sleeping bag, a handheld satellite GPS device, and enough dried rations for 5 days. My goal was to map out a new scenic route for my tour company before the winter snows closed down the higher elevations. But as the sun began to dip toward the western horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of purple and bruised orange, a sudden drop in atmospheric pressure brought in a dense, unnatural mist. Within minutes, visibility plummeted from 100 yards to less than 5 feet, making it impossible to see the blue trailblazes painted on the tree trunks. I reached into my chest pocket and pulled out my military-grade compass, but the needle was spinning erratically in fast, frantic circles, bouncing between north and south as if a powerful magnetic anomaly was pulsing from the rocks. Directly beneath my boots, I checked my digital GPS unit next, but the screen flickered violently before going completely blank, displaying a flashing red error message indicating 0 satellite connections. Despite being on an open, elevated crest, I knew I needed to set up camp immediately before the fading daylight disappeared completely. So I scrambled along the rocky ledge, searching for a flat piece of ground away from the sharp drops. That was when I realized I had accidentally crossed past the weathered wooden danger sign warning hikers to turn around, standing right on the narrow, treacherous precipice where the physical ridge abruptly ends into a sheer 200-foot drop down into the uncharted valley below. The air up there was impossibly cold, smelling sharply of wet stone, ozone, and something sickly sweet like decaying flowers and wet copper. As I unbuckled my pack to set up my small one-man tent, a sound echoed out from the thick, gray fog hanging directly over the empty air of the abyss. It was the distinct, rhythmic sound of heavy boots crunching softly over dry leaves and loose gravel, walking along a path that simply did not exist in physical space. I froze in place, holding my breath as I stared into the thick gray wall of mist hovering over the empty precipice where the rock cliff dropped off into nothingness. The footfalls were slow, deliberate, and steadily approaching my position, coming straight from the open air beyond the cliff edge. My brain struggled to process the physical impossibility of what my ears were hearing, forcing my hand to reach down and unholster the heavy steel hunting knife attached to my belt. I called out into the fog, demanding to know who was out there, but my voice sounded flat, muffled and strangely swallowed by the dense atmosphere, as if the air itself was trying to prevent my words from traveling. The crunching footsteps stopped right at the very edge of the cliff, just 3 feet in front of me, though I could see nothing through the swirling gray clouds except for the faint, shimmering outline of a human silhouette suspended in mid-air over the deadly drop. Suddenly, a voice spoke from the fog, not through the air, but echoing directly inside the hollow center of my chest, bypassing my ears entirely. It was a voice that felt old, heavy, and immensely powerful, sounding like 2 giant boulders grinding together deep underground. It did not ask questions or make threats. It simply made a calm, terrifying statement that sent a surge of icy panic through every vein in my body. It told me that I had stepped past the edge of the known world, entering a place where gravity, time, and human memory bleed together, and that no one who crosses the boundary where the ridge ends is ever permitted to return to the valley below. The moment those words echoed in my mind, the ground beneath my heavy boots began to vibrate violently, and the solid granite rock beneath my feet felt as soft and unstable as shifting wet sand, pulling my legs downward into the mountain itself. Terrified beyond reason, I turned around and sprinted back in the direction I had come, abandoning my heavy backpack, my tent, and all my gear on the cliff edge in a desperate bid to save my life. But as I ran through the blinding fog, I quickly realized that the trail I had walked up just 20 minutes earlier had completely transformed into a twisted, alien landscape. The path no longer went downhill toward the safety of the lower valleys. Instead, every direction I ran seemed to tilt upward, leading me right back to the exact same rocky ledge where the ridge ended. I ran for what felt like hours, my lungs burning with cold air and my heart hammer-pounding against my ribs. But no matter how fast I sprinted or how many sharp turns I made through the gnarled oak trees, the winding dirt trail kept looping back on itself, bringing me face to face with the exact same cliff face and the exact same hovering human silhouette. Waiting patiently in the fog, I was trapped in a spatial loop, caught in a terrifying geographic anomaly, where the mountain refused to let me step back into reality. The fog began to grow darker, turning from a pale gray into a pitch black mist that smelled heavily of wet earth and old iron, blotting out the stars and leaving me in absolute terrifying darkness. That was when the hallucinations began, or at least what I prayed were hallucinations. Figures began to emerge from the black mist surrounding the ledge, hundreds of pale, glowing silhouettes of men and women wearing clothing from different historical eras, ranging from modern, brightly colored hiking jackets to ragged, 19th century leather coats and ancient handcrafted garments. They were the lost travelers of the Appalachian Mountains, the hundreds of missing persons who had vanished without a trace over the centuries after stepping past the boundary where the ridge ends. They stood in silence along the precipice, staring at me with hollow, glowing eyes, their mouths moving in silent, synchronized unison as they beckoned me to step off the ledge and join them in the shifting void. My mental sanity began to snap under the relentless psychological pressure, and a strange, overwhelming feeling of exhaustion washed over my body, tempting me to just give up, close my eyes, step off the rocky ledge into the soft gray fog, and end the terrifying nightmare once and for all. My feet actually began to step forward on their own, moving toward the edge as if muscles were being controlled by invisible puppet strings pulled by the entity waiting in the abyss. I was just inches away from stepping off the 200-foot cliff when my hand brushed against a small, rough object in my jacket pocket, a heavy cast iron compass my grandfather had given me. I first became a guide, engraved with the simple words to always find your way home. The cold, hard reality of the solid iron metal in my palm acted like a jolt of high-voltage electricity, snapping my conscious mind back from the brink of the hypnotic trance. I remembered an old piece of mountain lore my grandfather used to tell me about dealing with lost spirits and unnatural spaces in the woods. He said that when the land turns against you and distorts your senses, you must turn your coat inside out and walk backward, refusing to trust what your eyes are seeing or what your brain is telling you about direction. With trembling hands, I ripped off my heavy winter jacket, turned it completely inside out so the bright orange thermal lining was facing outward, and put it back on. I squeezed my eyes tightly shut, turning my back to the cliff and the hovering silhouettes, and began taking slow, deliberate steps backward into the dark forest, relying entirely on my sense of touch and the physical weight of the iron compass in my hand. Every instinct in my body screamed at me that I was stepping off a cliff to my death, but I forced myself to ignore the phantom voices whispering in my head, the sudden icy winds pushing against my chest, and the terrifying sensation of falling that filled my inner ear. I kept walking backward in the pitch-black darkness for what felt like an eternity, taking one blind step at a time, reciting the names of every town, river, and mountain peak I knew in western North Carolina to keep my mind grounded in the real world. The air slowly began to change. the sickly sweet smell of wet copper fading away and being replaced by the fresh, clean scent of crushed pine needles and cold mountain stream water. The crushing pressure in my chest gradually lifted, and the frantic, chaotic spinning sound in my ears softened into the natural, comforting sound of the wind blowing through the high branches of the forest canopy. When I finally opened my eyes, the sun was just beginning to rise over the eastern horizon, casting long golden rays of light through the trees and burning away the thick gray fog that had held me captive throughout the night. I was standing on the well-marked main trail, nearly 3 miles down from the dangerous summit of Black Ridge, safe and sound in the familiar territory of the state park. My body was covered in scrapes, my clothes were soaked with dew, and my boots were caked in thick mud, but I was back in the real world, standing on solid, unmoving earth. I didn't stop to rest or look back. I ran the remaining 5 miles down to the trailhead parking lot, jumped into my truck, and drove straight back to civilization, never returning to pick up the gear I had left behind on the cliff. It has been nearly 2 years since that terrifying night on Black Ridge, and I have completely given up my job as a wilderness guide, refusing to step foot on any mountain trail that rises above the cloud line. I moved far away from the mountains, settling in a flat, sunlit coastal town where the horizon is open and the land doesn't play tricks on your mind. But whenever autumn arrives and the heavy fog rolls off the ocean, thick and gray against my living room window, I feel a cold, shivering dread settle deep into my bones. I know that somewhere high up in the Appalachian wilderness, where the dirt trail stops and the sheer rock face drops off into the endless mist, the ridge still ends and the lost travelers are still waiting in the fog for the next unsuspecting hiker to take one step too many into the dark. The mountain air in the deep hollers of eastern Kentucky does not just chill your skin, it settles into your bones like cold water. I moved into an isolated cabin near the edge of the Daniel Boone National Forest 3 months ago, looking for cheap rent, absolute silence, and a place to finish writing my novel. The locals at the gas station 5 miles down the dirt road gave me plenty of advice when I first bought groceries, but only one piece stuck with me. A weathered old man named Silas looked at my city license plate, leaned over the counter, and whispered a single, unwavering rule of the woods. If you hear something calling your name out in those trees, no, you didn't. You keep walking, you shut your doors, and you never look back. I laughed it off at the time, treating it as nothing more than charming rural folklore created to spook impressionable tourists. But I quickly learned that the people who survive in these ancient mountains do not tell stories just for entertainment. It started on a Tuesday evening around 8 o'clock, just as the sun dipped completely behind the jagged black ridge line and left the forest draped in a heavy, suffocating darkness. The fog was thick that night, rolling down from the peaks like ghost steam and swallowing every oak, pine, and rock until my front porch light was the only visible beacon for miles. I was sitting at my kitchen table with a mug of black coffee, typing away on my laptop when the sound first reached my ears. It was faint at first, barely louder than the hum of my refrigerator, but distinct enough to make my fingers freeze over the keyboard. It was a voice coming from deep within the tree line, floating through the damp air and tapping gently against the glass of my kitchen window. Julian! My heart skipped a beat, dropping straight to the pit of my stomach. I sat completely still, breathing quietly through my nose, listening to the silence that followed. The forest was dead quiet. No crickets, no owls, no rustling of wind through the leaves, just an absolute, unnatural stillness that made my ears ring. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind whistling through a gap in the wooden siding or perhaps an animal, making a strange nocturnal call. But then it happened again, clearer and closer this time. Julian, please, open the door. The voice made the hairs on my arm stand straight up, not just because it knew my name, but because of who it belonged to. It was the voice of my sister, Clara. The exact pitch, the familiar, gentle cadence, the subtle rise at the end of her sentence when she was anxious or tired. But there was one terrifying problem that made my entire body go numb. Clara had been living in Chicago for the last 5 years, and when I checked my phone 10 minutes prior, she had sent me a text message from her apartment 800 miles away. The thing standing outside in the pitch-black woods was using her voice, but it was not her. Silas's warning flashed across my mind in bright, screaming letters. If you hear something calling your name, no, you didn't. I swallowed hard, forcing my eyes to stay locked onto the blank wooden surface of my desk instead of drifting toward the dark window pane. My natural human instinct screamed at me to jump up, peek through the blinds, or shout into the darkness to demand who was out there playing a sick prank. But a deep, primal fear held me firmly in place. I knew that acknowledging the sound meant giving it power, and looking at it meant acknowledging its presence. I reached out with a trembling hand, grabbed my headphones, and jammed them tightly over my ears, playing a loud rock playlist to drown out the night. I sat at that table for 4 hours, staring blankly at my laptop screen while sweat poured down my spine, praying for the first light of dawn to break over the horizon. When morning finally came and the golden sunlight pierced through the mist, the oppressive atmosphere vanished as if it had never existed. Birds began to sing, the breeze rustled the high branches, and the woods looked peaceful, almost inviting. I stepped out onto the porch, clutching a warm mug of tea, and convinced myself that the entire experience had been a stress-induced auditory hallucination caused by isolation and lack of sleep. I took a deep breath of the cool mountain air and walked around to the side of the house, trying to regain my composure. But my heart instantly stopped when I reached the kitchen window. Pressed firmly against the glass from the outside were 3 long, mud-caked handprints. The fingers were impossibly long, featuring 4 distinct knuckles on each digit, stretching far beyond the dimensions of any human hand. Down in the soft, wet earth beneath the window, deep gouges had been carved into the soil, as if something heavy had been pacing back and forth for hours, waiting for me to answer. Panic surged through me like an electric shock. I ran inside, locked every bolt on the front and back doors, pulled down all the window shades, and immediately called Silas at the general store. My voice was shaking violently as I described the long fingers, the mud on the window, and the uncanny sound of my sister's voice calling to me from the fog. The voice made the hairs on my arm stand straight up, not just because it knew my name, but because of who it belonged to. It was the voice of my sister, Clara. The exact pitch, the familiar, gentle cadence, the subtle rise at the end of her sentence when she was anxious or tired. But there was one terrifying problem that made my entire body go numb. Clara had been living in Chicago for the last 5 years, and when I checked my phone 10 minutes prior, she had sent me a text message from her apartment 800 miles away. The thing standing outside in the pitch-black woods was using her voice, but it was not her. Silas's warning flashed across my mind in bright, screaming letters. If you hear something calling your name, no, you didn't. I swallowed hard, forcing my eyes to stay locked onto the blank wooden surface of my desk instead of drifting toward the dark window pane. My natural human instinct screamed at me to jump up, peek through the blinds, or shout into the darkness to demand who was out there playing a sick prank. But a deep, primal fear held me firmly in place. I knew that acknowledging the sound meant giving it power, and looking at it meant acknowledging its presence. I reached out with a trembling hand, grabbed my headphones, and jammed them tightly over my ears, playing a loud rock playlist to drown out the night. I sat at that table for 4 hours, staring blankly at my laptop screen while sweat poured down my spine, praying for the first light of dawn to break over the horizon. When morning finally came and the golden sunlight pierced through the mist, the oppressive atmosphere vanished as if it had never existed. Birds began to sing, the breeze rustled the high branches, and the woods looked peaceful, almost inviting. I stepped out onto the porch, clutching a warm mug of tea, and convinced myself that the entire experience had been a stress-induced auditory hallucination caused by isolation and lack of sleep. I took a deep breath of the cool mountain air and walked around to the side of the house, trying to regain my composure. But my heart instantly stopped when I reached the kitchen window. Pressed firmly against the glass from the outside were 3 long, mud-caked handprints. The fingers were impossibly long, featuring 4 distinct knuckles on each digit, stretching far beyond the dimensions of any human hand. Down in the soft, wet earth beneath the window, deep gouges had been carved into the soil, as if something heavy had been pacing back and forth for hours, waiting for me to answer. Panic surged through me like an electric shock. I ran inside, locked every bolt on the front and back doors, pulled down all the window shades, and immediately called Silas at the general store. My voice was shaking violently as I described the long fingers, the mud on the window, and the uncanny sound of my sister's voice calling to me from the fog. Silas did not sound surprised. His voice was flat, heavy, and full of grim realization. "It knows you're alone now, son," he said, the crackle of the landline making his words sound even more ominous. "That thing is an old resident of these ridges. It doesn't have a face, it doesn't have a soul, and it certainly doesn't have a voice of its own. It steals the sounds of the people you love to trick your mind into lowering your guard. Once you acknowledge it, once you answer it or look it in the eyes, it marks you. You ignored it last night, which saved your life, but now it knows your scent, and it knows you can hear it. It will come back tonight, and it will be much louder." "What do I do?" I pleaded, gripping the phone receiver so hard my knuckles turned white. "Can I drive out of here? Can I just pack my bags and leave right now?" "Do not drive down that mountain road after dark," Silas warned sternly. "It waits in the canopy above the dirt track. If you try to drive away at night, it will drop onto your roof or throw something in front of your tires to make you crash. You stay inside until morning. Put salt along your door thresholds. Cover every mirror in the house so you don't catch a glimpse of its reflection by mistake. And no matter what you hear, no matter who begs you for help, no matter how much they scream or cry, you do not open that door, and you do not make a sound." I spent the rest of the afternoon preparing my house like a fortress. I dragged heavy wooden dressers in front of the doors, nailed thick wooden boards across the ground floor windows, and poured thick lines of white table salt across every entryway. I covered the bathroom and hallway mirrors with dark bath towels, ensuring there was no reflective surface that could trick my eyes in the dim light. I gathered a flashlight, a heavy iron crowbar, and sat down in the center of the living room, far away from any outer walls. As the sun began its slow descent behind the jagged peaks, the temperature inside the cabin plummeted, and a suffocating silence once again settled over the hollers. By 10 o'clock, the storm hit. Thunder rumbled across the valley, making the cabin floor vibrate beneath my feet, and heavy rain battered the tin roof with a deafening roar. I thought the sound of the rain would drown out whatever was lurking outside, but I was wrong. The thing did not need quiet to make itself heard. Its voice cut through the sound of the pouring rain and roaring thunder like a sharp razor blade, slicing through paper. It started at the back door. Heavy, deliberate thuds slammed against the reinforced wood, rattling the metal hinges until dust fell from the doorframe. Then came the voice, but it was no longer just Clara. "Julian, open up! It's freezing out here." My sister's voice screamed from the porch, sounding terrified and drenched in rain. A second later, another voice joined in from the front window. It was the distinct, raspy tone of my late grandfather, who had passed away 3 years ago. "Let us in, boy. You're leaving your family out in the cold. What's wrong with you?" Then came a third voice and a fourth, overlapping and bleeding into one another until a chorus of familiar relatives, old friends, and former lovers were all begging, shouting, and weeping outside my cabin walls. They knew intimate details, calling out private childhood nicknames and recounting specific memories that only my family would know. The psychological torture was unbearable. My brain was screaming at me that my loved ones were dying out in the storm, urging my hands to lift the wooden boards and slide back the deadbolts to save them. Tears streamed down my face as I clamped my hands over my ears, rocking back and forth on the hard floor, repeating Silas's rule like a sacred mantra over and over in my head. "It's not them. If you hear it, no you didn't. It's not them. If you hear it, no you didn't." Suddenly, the chorus of human voices stopped all at once, replaced by a sound that made my blood run completely cold. It was a wet, unnatural scraping sound moving across the metal tin roof directly above my head. Heavy, uneven footsteps dragged themselves across the beams, bending the thin sheet metal inward under immense weight. Whatever was up there was massive, crawling on all fours right above the living room ceiling. I looked up in sheer horror as the wooden ceiling panels began to creak and groan. Drops of dark, foul-smelling liquid began to seep through the cracks between the wooden planks, dripping down onto the living room rug with a slow, sickening rhythm. The creature slowly lowered its torso until it was resting directly above the central light fixture. Then, from directly above me, a voice echoed down through the wood. Not my sister's voice, not my grandfather's voice, but a horrifying, stitched-together mashup of every voice it had used that night, switching syllables mid-word like an audio tape being spliced together by a lunatic. "Judy M., I know you are in there," it hissed, the pitch bouncing erratically from a deep bass to a high-pitched screech. "Look at me." The urge to look up at the ceiling was almost overwhelming, a strange magnetic pull dragging my chin upward. But I forced my eyes shut tight and slammed my face down against my knees. I dug my fingernails into the palms of my hands until they bled, using the physical pain to keep my mind focused and grounded in reality. I refused to look. I refused to speak. I refused to acknowledge the nightmare looming just inches above my head. For 3 agonizing hours, the creature put on its terrifying display. It pounded on the roof, scraped its long claws against the wooden walls, and mimicked every person I had ever cared about, begging, bargaining, and threatening my life in endless looping cycles. It tried to break my sanity, waiting for a single slip-up, a single gasp of fear, or a single glance upward that would grant it permission to tear through the ceiling and drag me out into the dark, endless woods. But I remained absolute motionless silence. I became a statue in the center of the room, breathing as shallowly as possible, ignoring the foul stench of rotting leaves and iron filling the cabin, ignoring the terrifying thuds that shook the foundation, and ignoring the relentless voices calling my name from every angle of the house. Slowly, agonizingly, the heavy black night began to fade. The rain softened from a torrential downpour into a gentle drizzle, and the first faint light of dawn began to bleed through the cracks of the boarded-up windows. The moment the dark sky turned from black to a deep indigo gray, a long, frustrated screech echoed from the roof, a sound so loud and terrible it shattered 2 glass window panes. In the upstairs bedroom, heavy thuds retreated across the tin panels, followed by the sound of something large dropping heavily onto the wet forest floor below and bounding away into the deep ravine at impossible speeds, snapping thick tree branches as it fled from the morning sun. When full daylight finally flooded the mountainside, I stood up on legs that felt like lead. My body was shaking violently from exhaustion and adrenaline, but I was alive. I did not waste a single second packing my belongings or checking the damage to the roof. I grabbed my car keys, unbarricaded the front door, and sprinted straight to my sedan parked in the driveway. As I opened the driver's door, I glanced up at the cabin roof. The tin sheets were bent and twisted, covered in deep, jagged claw marks and coated in a thick, black substance that was already evaporating under the warm morning sunlight. I jumped into the car, slammed the engine into gear, and hit the gas, speeding down the winding dirt road without ever looking in my rearview mirror. I drove for 6 hours without stopping, leaving Kentucky, the mountains, and the ancient forest far behind me. I moved to a busy, overcrowded city where the bright streetlights never turn off, and the noise of traffic drowns out the night. But even now, surrounded by millions of people and concrete walls, I never sleep without headphones. And on quiet, foggy nights when the wind blows hard against my apartment window, I sometimes catch a faint, familiar whisper floating through the dark air, calling my name in a voice I know all too well. When that happens, I just close my eyes, turn up the music, and remind myself of the ancient rule of the Appalachians. If you hear it, no, you didn't.